Of Love and Legend, written and narrated by Vanessa Eccles. The quiet whispers of the wood lured me, promising safety in the familiar, comfortable enchantment of the creatures within. As I heeded its call, stepping into the soft, wet landscape of the forest's underbelly, my bow in tow, something struck me as wrong. It was too quiet, too guarded. Tensions swept around me, whipping hair from my braid, making my dress cling to my body. Everything a warning. A lightning strike shocked the nearby knoll, confirming my suspicion. "Gwen!" My little sister's voice echoed through the gray, a darkness that had always surrounded my life. I will never escape. Even being so far away, I still caught a quiver in her voice. Something was wrong. Something is always wrong. I stepped away from the wood, my beloved wood, the only place I found peace. It had been explained to me how important it was for me to marry, and fast. It wouldn't be long before I'd be too old to do anything, but I didn't feel old. I felt alive. The wood always revived me, stripping away that haunting numbness. I followed the winding path up the hill, reaching farther and farther into the gray sky. I hadn't a clue what could be wrong or why Morgan was calling my name. After a few minutes of walking, someone caught my eye at the edge of the wood. I was too far to know who he was. The villagers have always told all sorts of tales about the horrors that lurk in the forest, fairies and witches and such. I had a choice: go to Morgan or explore my curiosity. I let my feet and my heart decide what they wanted to do, like I always had before. I followed the figure. As soon as I returned to the wood, darkness enveloped me. Its cool, comforting arms embraced me. I followed the rustling of the leaves and the sound of the water. This wasn't a part of the wood that I had explored often, but I've walked along these paths long enough to know there wasn't a trace of water for miles. Not knowing who the person was, I decided to keep my distance. I didn't want him to know I was here. My mother had taught me how to creep, how to step with the softness of a lady, and listen with the keenness of a friend who was about to betray. It was a gift she had, one that had kept my father wondering for years how many of his secrets she'd uncovered. My best guess? All of them. As I stepped closer, I finally got a clearer look. It was a boy. Well, not exactly a boy, more like a young man. Possibly around my age, maybe slightly older, with striking blonde hair. Much to my surprise, I realized the forest I'd loved so much still had its secrets. Water did exist here. I approached the edge and stared at my reflection in the mirror-smooth surface. How do I not know about this? Has it always been here? I'd walked these woods countless times and never seen this. A clear blue pond stretched between the man and me. The moon peered down at us from the opening in the forest. Illuminated gemstones speckled the blackening sky. The moon was so big it could swallow us if it opened its mouth. I hid in the trees, not wanting him to know I was here. For a brief moment, I thought about Morgan calling me, and how often she'd called me back to our wretched home for something small and ridiculous. She probably wanted her hair braided or to practice a conversation she wanted to have with Landon, her new beau. I'd grown tired of responding to her every need. She was far too old to be minded by her sister. She could make her own decisions. Mesmerized, I watched as the man unexpectedly began taking off his clothing. He tossed his linen shirt onto a rock. Knowing I shouldn't be watching, I hesitated. I turned away, only to find myself looking again. The flinching of his chest muscles made my breath catch. I couldn't stop watching, and when he began to unbutton his trousers, I found myself biting my lip, wondering how long I'd allow myself this guilty pleasure. No lady watches a man unclothed who's not her husband. No lady who knew someone was watching, that is. He doesn't know I'm here. No one knows. I bit my lip hard as he slipped off his pants and slid his body into the lake. He bathed himself, running his hands down his chest, his back, his torso. I studied every move, every curve. He was beautiful, more beautiful than anything I'd ever seen. I'm not sure how much time passed. We were both enjoying our moment in the wood under the disguise of moonlight and darkness and the creepy shadows that stretched before us. Just when I was sure he was finished and my fantasy would inevitably end, movement in the water distracted me. An arm arose from the middle of the lake, holding a sword. The bizarre scene made me bat my eyes, convinced that I must be imagining things. He swam to the arm, gently took the sword from the delicate hand, a woman's hand, and swam toward the shore. He propped the sword on the rock and reached for his clothing. Movement from nearby caught my attention, but I didn't see anything. Maybe I was wrong about that too. The man stood there completely naked and shivered in the cold wind, but he heard it also. His body turned to face the noise, and that's when I saw another, slightly older man, pointing a bow directly at him. Without thought, I slung my bow around my shoulder, aimed an arrow, and released. A feather from the arrow tip clipped my face, causing a minor surge of pain. It took me a moment to realize what I had done. The man fell, grasped at his chest, and sucked in 2 last breaths before collapsing. From my vantage point, I could see it all so perfectly, so clearly. That's when I realized that the man I'd been watching was now watching me. Not knowing how to proceed, I approached him. Strangely, I felt a strong force pulling us together. He didn't try to cover himself. It was as if he felt no shame and didn't even recognize that he was naked. My cheeks burned with embarrassment like never before when I realized who he was. The king. The cool blue of his eyes reminded me of a spring sky long ago, back when things were not as gray. So long ago that I couldn't be sure if it were a memory or a dream. He shivered. Every twitch of his skin sparkled in the moonlight, making him look otherworldly, angelic, irresistible. I didn't know I was staring until he reached his trembling hand to my cheek. "You're bleeding," he said just above a whisper, as he wiped away a drop of blood from my rose-colored face. I opened my mouth to speak, but I didn't know what to say. I had just killed someone. The awful truth lay before me, uglier than I'd imagined. The man traced my glance, and we both stared at the dead man on the wet ground. The creatures of the wood were already devouring him. "Thank you." His voice was soft. My mouth tried to say something, anything, but couldn't. Something bound me. I didn't know if it was a remarkable attraction or some secret enchantment the wood placed upon me. "He was going to kill you," I said matter-of-factly. He nodded and gently patted my back as a friend would. He acted too nonchalant, too friendly, to a stranger in the wood who was watching while he bathed. Fire burned my cheeks and every part of me. I turned away again, attempting to hide the shame I felt for not behaving like a lady. I turned to give him privacy as he dressed. How amazingly silly of me to have not done so before now. As he pulled his shirt over his head, I decided to be a bit more helpful and handed him the sword. It glowed beneath my hands, a soft, blinding blue. "I won't pretend to understand what I've seen here tonight," I told him. He took the sword from me with the same gentleness as when he took it from the mysterious arm in the lake. "I won't ask you to. May I walk you home?" he asked, sliding the weapon into its sheath. I nodded, and the 2 of us went back the way we came, down the long narrow path of green and up toward the gray sky. I'd always heard that the wood was enchanted, but until today, I'd never experienced anything like that. Unexplainable comfort and escape, yes, but this was something else. "Why did he want to kill you?" I finally asked, needing to relieve my conscience. "Your king is grateful," was all he said. He stopped, turned to look at me, took my arm in one hand, and cupped my cheek with the other. He tugged at my earlobe lovingly. Shocks spread through my veins, down my legs, and my arms. I could no longer keep my eyes open. I could barely stand, and my knees felt like they'd buckle under the weight of his perfection. I couldn't make sense of whatever was happening to my body, my heart, my mind. I couldn't breathe. Then he let me go. I fell forward and rested on his chest. For a moment, just a moment, I allowed myself to be moved by his heart. Up and down. I quickly caught myself and instinctively pulled away. There was no denying that something was different. I had not been the same since encountering him. "So this is you, then?" he asked as we approached my family's cottage. Morgan stepped onto the stone steps, her blonde hair whipping in the wind, her arms dangling mysteriously at her side, her face as white as snow. My eyes widened at the look of her. She frightened me. She had needed me, but I didn't come to her. I knew she was in distress, and I did not come. Something kept me there. I looked back at the wood accusingly. Enchantment. "Miss," Arthur said to her, reaching out as if to comfort her. She put her hand in his. My heart raced as she buried her face into his chest. He gently stroked her back as she sobbed into him. "Father's dead." Her cries muffled the words. Arthur glanced at me, reading my expression, reading my very soul. I felt numb. I knew I should be crying, but no tears came. Instead, I stared at him, trying to make sense of the night. I had saved the king, but I could not save my father. Not that I wanted to. I watched as he consoled her like a father would a daughter, like a father I never knew. She leaned into him, her long lashes brushing against his shirt, lazy eyes occasionally peering up at the gorgeous face before her. She'd never been reluctant with men, but she had never experienced the father I knew. "Hello, ma'am," Arthur said while looking at the doorway of the stone house. "Hello?" Mother's eyes glared at him. A flash of recognition washed across her face, and she began to look pale. She knew exactly who he was, just as I had. She bowed slightly, furiously wiping the tears from her eyes. When she was able to compose herself, she went to Morgan and peeled her arms off of King Arthur. "My lord, it is our great pleasure having you here. Is there anything we can do to be of service?" Her words came out like a foreign voice from her body, one I'd never heard before. She sounded regal, polished, very unlike her country self. "I was just escorting your daughter home," Arthur said while exchanging a glance with me. Mother's eyes flickered my way. I thought I saw a flash of fear, but wasn't sure why. Royals were greatly feared in the past, but our current king had been known for his kindness and generosity. After meeting him, I suspected all the stories were true. "You must come inside, it's warmer in there, and a neighbor was kind enough to share their meal with us, considering the circumstance." Although it seemed like only minutes since Morgan had called my name while I was in the forest, an hour at most, somehow during that time our neighbor had brought food. Time, too, seemed strangely off. We followed my mother inside the house, and the thick aroma of stew tickled my nose, reminding my stomach how hungry I was, how desperately hungry I was. She scooped a bowl of soup and broke off a large chunk of bread for each of us. She usually didn't feed us so heartily since food was a scarcity we couldn't afford to spare. "Thank you," Arthur said as he continued to keep his eyes on me. We ate in peace. Strangers would have supposed that we were a typical family, hiding secrets behind our silence, not wanting to confront each other with the truth of our day. That wouldn't be too far from the truth. Morgan and I helped my mother clear the table. Arthur offered his assistance, but my mother would have no part in the king cleaning dishes. Mother's eyes were wide and glazed as if she were in shock. I knew she needed time to grieve, but I still wanted to know what happened to my father. We didn't talk about unpleasant things in this house. It wasn't our way. We prided ourselves on being resilient to whatever life offered us. But today, Morgan and Mother deserved time to process. I, on the other hand, still felt nothing, with the exception of what I couldn't deny feeling for Arthur. A strange, unprecedented lust. Sin. How did he die? I finally garnered the nerve to ask my mother. It wasn't until afterward that I realized my words sounded coarse, harsh, and without feeling. It wasn't a secret to anyone that I didn't feel emotionally attacked by the day's events. My father had not been a father. He fell off his horse near the Conways' farm. They brought us the news. They took him to the chapel. And the horse? I asked. I know you love that horse, but I don't see how that's important right now, she said, with a hint of anger in her voice. I stepped outside to find Arthur on the porch steps. Morgan sat next to him, gently dabbing her cheeks with a handkerchief, milking every moment of his attention. Please sit, Arthur said, motioning for me to take a seat beside him. Morgan went on about what a wonderful father we had. He was a loyal, noble man who did his best to serve both crown and country, she had said. I could barely hold back my disgust. It wasn't her fault she felt that way, but that didn't stop me from having a strong reaction to the lies. Arthur studied me like he was reading my soul. His gaze sent a prickle down in my stomach and made me feel nauseous, exposed, and vulnerable. All the things I hated most. Would you mind giving us a moment? Arthur gently interrupted Morgan. She nodded and reluctantly made her way back into the house, closing the door almost without a sound. What happened to your father? He fell off his horse. The neighbor found him near the roadway by the farm. The horse is missing. The same empty voice fell from my lips. How incredibly selfish, unloving, and ungrateful I must look to him. You don't seem to be bothered by his passing, Arthur said as more of a question than a statement. Everyone dies, I answered, dusting the invisible dust from my dress. There's so much I didn't want to say. Arthur must have sensed this because he said, he was unkind to you. I brushed the dark hair from my face. Even more than that, huh? We are all unkind, I told him, biting my lip hard enough to hurt. I hated myself for taking up for my father, even if only to cover up what I didn't want to say. Heaven forbid I make excuses for the man who caused me to hate this life and everyone in it. What did he do to you? Arthur turned to face me, his knee brushing against mine. A shockwave surged through my body. I had to remind myself, he wasn't mine. The king would never be mine. We all have our secrets, I told him. At this, Arthur reached for me, ran his hand behind my ear, down my neck, caught a strand of hair, and twisted it around his finger. I could hardly breathe, and I hated myself for it. I'm not as naive as all the other girls he's met. I won't be. I wouldn't allow myself to become just another girl who swooned at his feet, gave him some pleasantries, and was tossed away like rubbish. Never. But something in me wanted to tell him everything. I wanted to tell him all about my past, my father, and anything else he wanted to know. A part of me wanted to please him, but I knew nothing could possibly satisfy a legend, definitely not a peasant girl who had been spent years ago. You don't have to tell me. I see it in your eyes, all the pain. He turned away and looked into the darkness. I couldn't be sure, but there seemed to be something magical about him, something incredible and also unnatural. How can you possibly know? I realized that my tone sounded accusatory, combative even. But it was true. How could he know? He may be an enchanted fairy person or some legend stepping out of a children's tale, but he couldn't possibly know my past. And I didn't appreciate anyone who suspected they did. I'll never understand why men do what they do. He rubbed his lips together as if he were perplexed, or maybe even sad. I couldn't tell which. Of all the people I'd met in my life, he was one I couldn't read. Me either, I added. We both sat and watched the stars way out in the distance, the unknown hovering over us like a false promise and a secret it would never keep. I must go, but I didn't get your name, he said, breaking my heart into a million pieces. I didn't want him to leave. I longed for the enchantment to continue. Guinevere, I told him. He kissed my hand, sending a raging storm of emotions swirling within me. Arthur walked away from us that night, leaving us to our misery. It was a strange thing to feel more loss at the king leaving, someone I'd barely known, than for the father who raised me. And he was gone, just like that, as if he'd never even existed. The next few days were horror, burying my father and comforting my mother and sister. I didn't have much time to fully process that day's events. Every free moment I had, I daydreamed about the king who once stepped into my life, who I had saved, and who showed me that the impossible does exist. Ordinary days can unexpectedly turn into life-changing ones. I kept replaying the way he looked in the moonlight, his touch on my cheek, and the sound of his strong, steadily pumping heart in my ear. I felt like a silly girl who had allowed herself to indulge too much in a fantasy. But then again, shouldn't I be allowed to have one fantasy? The night sky loomed beyond the opened window. I wasn't sure if it was just me or my relentless desires, but this night felt similar to the one when we met. There was an enchantment in the air. My father had always spoken of days when magic was prevalent and close to those who were close to it. I knew it was nothing but a fairy tale he told Morgan and me after one of his more commendable days. But after meeting Arthur, I couldn't be sure anymore. I'd killed a man to save another, and that thought wouldn't leave me. Somehow I'd lost myself in someone else, forgetting about who I was before him. Will I ever be the same again? I drifted to sleep thinking about these things. Somewhere in the distance, someone called my name. Guinevere. Guinevere. I opened my eyes to see him standing outside my window, curly locks shimmering, blue eyes piercing through me, seeing the very depths of me. I hesitated. A lady wouldn't sneak out under the cover of night with a man she barely knew. But neither does she watch a man bathe. Convinced that I'd lost my honor long ago, I went to him. He took my hand and helped me slide through the window. I fell into him, his strong arms wrapped around my slender torso. He had great strength, but he was more gentle than I ever could have imagined a warring knight to be. I knew better. I would be the talk of the village if word got out that I was sneaking around unsupervised with a man, let alone the king. And that was another thing. He was the king. Under his rule, I must adhere to what he says. I would gladly do whatever he asked of me. I rubbed my temples as I became completely aware of my internal dialogue. Who am I? I don't even recognize myself anymore. It was as if I didn't even have control of myself, my thoughts, or my actions. I glanced at him, strong, set jaw and bright blue eyes focused on the path ahead. I wanted to touch him, feel the magic of his embrace. I felt control slipping from my grasp. I hadn't been right since I set foot in the wood that night. This wasn't like me. Every time I thought about a companion, the memory of what had been done to me would vanquish any hopes I had until I met him. But he wasn't mine. He isn't mine. What does he want with me? He held out his hand, an invitation to follow him. I hesitated again and found myself fidgeting. Suddenly, committedly, I snatched his hand as if it were something decadent, something irresistible. We made our way up the green knolls toward the darkened sky and back into the wood by the lake. I was surprised when he took off his boots and waded into the water. I removed my slippers and dipped into the icy blue with him. When the cold surface reached my chest, he stopped, pulled me closer to him, and held my hands. A slight smile escaped his lips as he looked up into the speckled sky. Wind whipped around us, freezing me to my core. Suddenly, without warning, the lake began to rise, drop by drop, into the sky. A sort of reverse rain that I'd never seen before. Tiny blue lapis lazuli floated magically into the heavens. The drops surrounded us on every side. I could feel the water lower as it escaped into the air above. My shift clung to me, exposing more than I'd ever felt comfortable allowing someone to see. Fear warned me to run from this, everything I couldn't understand. But it felt right, safe. I stepped closer to him, only our breath lingered between us. Like an unspoken boundary neither of us were brave enough to cross. He ran a hand down my shoulder, my arm, and into my palm. His other hand took my waist and pulled me closer still. My body shivered for a multitude of reasons. This isn't me. But I didn't care. "I see you found her," a voice said in the distance. Our eyes followed the direction of the sound, but the water was still thick in the air. We couldn't see. Not knowing who it was, I pressed myself into Arthur. I didn't have my bow, and feeling exposed, I had no other choice but to rely on his protection. "Guinevere, meet Merlin," Arthur murmured. I had heard of Merlin. Everyone had. The ancient wizard had his own set of legends. He stepped closer to us, waving his staff and shooing away the lingering drops. "Hello there. Do you have any idea why we summoned you tonight?" he asked in a direct and commanding voice. I looked at Arthur, half expecting that he'd tell Merlin he wanted to see me. When that didn't happen, I averted my eyes, embarrassed. I had hoped Arthur came to see me because I'd been consuming his thoughts like he had mine. I thought, it didn't matter what I thought. I pulled away from Arthur, distancing myself from him and the situation. Naive girl. I wrapped my arms around my chest, covering myself. I turned to Merlin, stood as confidently as I could, and stared at him, waiting for an explanation. The man stroked his beard as if he were studying me, as if he were reading me like one of his ancient books. A flicker of recognition passed across his face. "As lovely as this is, the thought that the two of you could have found love at first sight, I'm afraid it isn't true. We're here because you touched the sword." The man pointed to the sword hanging from Arthur's belt. He knew I had touched it. I was trying to help him, I explained, but hesitated. "To get dressed." I glanced at Arthur, afraid I'd embarrass him or myself more if I told the full story. I wasn't taking it. I didn't know what he was getting at, but I had to make it clear that I'd never steal or harm the king. Ever. "No, that's not what I'm saying. You see, dearie, the sword made a decision that you two will be married. I'm afraid the two of you no longer have any say in the matter. And by the looks of things, perhaps that's not such a bad thing after all." The wizard plopped on a rock and looked at us as if we were some sort of entertainment. "I had to see for myself, though. My primary concern is always for the king. I'm sure you can understand," he stated. Arthur took the sword and pointed it in my direction. "Touch it," the wizard told me. I slid my finger across the blade, careful not to touch the sharpened edge. Arthur placed his hand over mine until we were both tracing the letters engraved on the sword. It illuminated beneath our touch so brightly that we both had to turn away. "That settles it. Excalibur has chosen you, Guinevere. You shall be Arthur's wife," Merlin concluded. I wrapped my arms around myself again, trying to make sense of what this would mean for my future. The king's wife. But also, what did it mean for him? How could he stand there and allow a sword to decide his future? And how does its reaction say anything at all? Excalibur is not just a sword, Merlin said, as if reading my mind. It was sent here from the afterlife to protect Arthur, and the mission set before him. Providence has decided that you are the one to marry him. It's simple. I can read that you want him. So why the resistance? Merlin's eyebrow rose as if he was awaiting a response, and not a vocal one. I wondered what Arthur wanted. Once again, he was hard to read. I found myself the next morning in the most unexpected situation, being escorted by the royal guard inside the gates of Camelot. As we bounced along the pebbled road, a memory crept into my mind and planted itself there. My father and I headed into town for market. My mother's words echoed in the back of my mind, the list of things she wanted and food we needed to restock up on. It was the first time I was allowed to visit Camelot. It had been a dream of mine for years. I remembered begging my mother to take me there, but she never would. She told me it was a dangerous place for people like us. That made no sense to me, but at such a tender age, I believed she would never say a lie. On this one occasion, my father came to me with wildflowers in his hand and asked me to join him to Camelot. It began as the most thrilling day of my life. As we approached the large iron gates, the guards dressed in their polished uniforms of red and gray opened up the door to a whole new world, one I had only dreamed of. I was finally about to see the place on the other side of the wall, where all the people were, where real life existed, the lives that mattered, anyway, definitely not country folk like us. Music filled the street, people smiled and laughed, dressed in their finest clothing. It was glorious. It was painfully clear that we didn't belong there. I didn't care, though. I wanted to be where the people were. I wanted to be those people, dress like them, parade in the streets on sunny days and eat like them. A round, perfect roll of bread tempted me. I spread my fingers across its surface, holding it in my hand, and then squeezed. My stomach turned over on itself, rumbling. I almost took it. "Take your palms off that," Father had said. I knew better than to cross him. We found the market straight away and loaded our sacks with the things Mother said to get. As we walked away, I was surprised when Father made a detour. "This looks like a beautiful dress. I bet it'd look great on your mother." My father held the dress up to me as if he were trying to get an idea of size. He purchased the garment and then suggested we stop by the nearby tavern. He tossed a couple of coins to the maiden at the counter and led me to a room up a flight of twisting stairs. I sat our sacks on the floor when we got into the chamber. A warm fire burned in the chimney and a candle chandelier hung over a four-poster bed. My father tossed me the dress. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, and tucked the memory back where it belonged. "Welcome home," Arthur said as he helped me from the carriage. My whole body burned with passion at his touch. I couldn't put my finger on what made him so alluring. What is it about him that makes me want to tear down every wall and let him in? It didn't matter what Merlin said. The decision had been made. But I couldn't help but be grateful that he was taking me away from memories that I had long wished to forget. "There's a celebration tonight. There wasn't much time for you to make your own preparations, so I've taken the liberty of choosing a dress and accessories for you. I hope it pleases you." He leaned in and whispered. His voice was as smooth as milk and honey, and his words tasted just as sweet. I followed the maid up the stairs into an elaborately decorated room. A gold gown laid across the bed. After the ladies had finished tidying me up, I barely recognized myself. I looked like a princess, like someone almost worthy being seen with a legend. Joyful laughter and the sound of string instruments filled the halls as I followed the maid to the grand room. My heart skipped as I thought about why I was here and who I was going to be with. He stood on the other side of the room, a goblet in his hands. He raised it when he saw me and joined my side. The crowd hushed and watched him, completely mesmerized by the graceful way he carried himself. "Ladies and gentlemen, your future queen," Arthur said, smiling. The crowd cheered as thoughts swirled through my mind. How can this be? Yesterday a peasant, today a future queen. He took my hand and placed it on his chest. I fingered the careful stitching of his collar and stared into his stunning blue eyes. I knew I could marry him. After the obligatory dance, a tall, dark, nameless knight whisked Arthur away. They stepped through the sheer drapes that waved in the breeze and onto the terrace overlooking Camelot and its inhabitants. I skirted the wall, pressed my back against it, leaned my ear to their conversation, and peeked through the doorway. I had noticed the knight watching us, and something about him made me suspicious. "Do you know anything about this girl you've committed yourself to? I don't understand why you'd make such an important decision so hastily. It isn't necessary. There are plenty of suitable women who would be honored to be your wife. Why her, Art? Why?" "Merlin and Excalibur have confirmed the wishes of Avalon. She is the one. I am grateful for your heart, friend, but do not be afraid. She is an honorable woman," Arthur told him and placed his hand on his friend's shoulder. "Honorable? You haven't any idea who her father is, do you? And what he did to your father? How can you not know this?" The man's voice nearly screeched in frustration. Arthur didn't say anything, only looked away and shook his head as if he didn't approve of the conversation. My stomach rebelled, making me feel as if I'd throw up. How could I have ever believed that my sins wouldn't stalk me? Of course, his friends would be leery of their great king marrying a nobody, a girl whose father was the very scum of the earth. What a foolish girl I'd been, allowing myself to fall into a dream. "He betrayed your father, but to save his family devastation, the king spared his life. He made advances toward your mother. Don't you find that revolting? His blood runs through her veins." The man pointed in my direction accusatorily. "She has inherited the sins of her father." "We each have free will," Arthur said in a steady voice. There was a lilt in his tone that I hadn't heard from him before, something that resembled anger. He turned to walk away, but the man took his arm. Arthur's eyes met his jaw and fist clenching. The knight immediately let go. "She will betray you," the man said, dark eyes firmly planted on his king. Arthur said nothing, took a breath, and returned to the party through a distant doorway. The knight walked by and noticed me standing beside the wall. I imagined he was curious at how much I'd heard of their conversation. To satisfy his curiosity, I approached him, leaned in, and whispered in his ear, "I am not my father." I didn't wait for his reaction. I simply walked away. I would never be anything like my father. Everything he'd done to me made certain of that. I may have his blood, but I do not have his traitorous heart. "My dear," Arthur said, coming from behind, placing his hands on my hips and twirling me around quickly. "May I have this dance?" I batted my eyes at him, my way of saying yes. As he took me into his arms and gently guided me across the floor, I studied him, trying to find any evidence that his feelings for me had changed because of his friend's warning. He appeared kind as usual, but remained unreadable. Had he ever cared for me at all? Or was his decision to marry me only an act of honor and duty? His hand gripped the small of my back, and he pulled me even closer. Close enough that my breath caught in my throat, threatening to choke me with passion. I turned away, not wanting him to see how much his touch affected me. "You are beautiful tonight. I've never met a woman of your character. Your strength far outweighs my own." His whispered words were like hot arrows piercing my very soul. I leaned into him. Our bodies moved in perfect rhythm to the music, our hearts in perfect harmony. "Will you come with me?" he asked after the song had ended. I nodded. By now, I think even he knew I'd follow him anywhere. I had followed him anywhere. As soon as we stepped out of the castle, the wind enveloped us. He asked a servant to fetch his horse. He held my hand in his as we waited. Arthur pulled himself up onto the stallion and then pulled me behind him. We rode through the gates and into the darkness for several minutes before we stopped at a familiar place. The edge of the wood looked like a black wall in the night. I hadn't been back since the night we'd met Merlin, and I couldn't help but feel a little nervous. I never followed up on what happened to the man I shot. Part of me didn't want to know, and I was too afraid to ask. Never ask questions you don't want to know the answers to. That was something my father had taught me. One of the only valuable things besides how to shoot. "Why'd you bring me here?" I asked Arthur, squeezing his hand in mine. The cold night reminded me of the evening we met. Everything was the same, except that now everything was different. The night sky still twinkled diamonds. The cold wind still wrapped around me, but instead of being alone, I was now with him. Our feet shuffled through the underbrush until we made it to where the lake once was. A muddy crater in the earth told us we were in the right place. I imagined the blue water raining in reverse as it had that night, returning to some place in the sky where it once belonged. "It's still beautiful here," I whispered more to myself than to him. "It's one of my favorite places in the world. It's magical. Shall we sit?" Arthur perched himself on the same rock he had his clothes strewn over the night we met. My face flushed with the memory of quietly watching him bathe in the moonlight. I sat next to him, trying to borrow some of his warmth. I didn't have a cloak with me, so the night wind was almost too much. I felt we needed a little time together to get to know one another. Arthur placed his hand on top of my knee, which made my heart flutter. "What do you want to know?" I asked him. "I want to know what your father did to you, and why you didn't grieve for his loss." The question caught me off guard, but it shouldn't have. After all, his knight had brought up my father just hours earlier. I didn't want to talk about him. I didn't want to talk about anything from my past. I wanted to keep it buried beneath hardened layers I liked to imagine I had. "He wasn't a kind man," I shifted nervously, repeating what he already knew. "Yes, but how unkind was he?" "I think you're aware of his sins, some of them at least," I said a bit more harshly than I intended. "I do not hold his misgivings against you, Guinevere." He was the only person who called me by my full name. "I want you to know that I believe people have the freedom to choose their destiny, to some extent." "Like you do yours?" It sounded more sarcastic than I hoped, but I was genuinely interested in his answer. It sure didn't seem like he had any choice in his future. "I accepted my destiny. I chose it. It's not something I had to do, but it is something I felt I had to do. Does that make sense?" He stared out into the wood as if that's where his words resided. He carefully pulled each of them from the abyss and fed them to me, trying to make sense of something I struggled to comprehend. "I'm not from here," he added. "I know all about who you are," I interrupted. "I remember the story of your father, Uther Pendragon, the great defender of his people. He was a good man. Not like mine." "That's not what I mean. I'm not from Earth. As Merlin mentioned, I'm from Avalon." "And where is this Avalon?" "It's a place in the heavens. I'm a part of a selective group of beings who have been sent here to save humanity. We're called Legend." My confusion must have been apparent because he continued, I know it's a lot to take in, but I hope you will someday understand. And how do I fit into all of this? Merlin said that Excalibur chose me, but isn't that just a sword? Excalibur is a being as well. He is my guardian, as Merlin explained. He will help me on my chosen mission. We were both sent here not only to protect Camelot, but also to plant a seed of honor and goodness back into this very lost world. That's just hard to believe, he interjects. I know. But you have a natural father. How is that possible? I asked. He was merely an earthly father. We have to be born into the world to become fully human. I shake my head in disbelief. Now tell me about your father. What did he do to you? I'll never tell a soul. My lips formed a thin, stubborn line. Arthur wrapped his right arm around me and squeezed me to him. I didn't want to give in to him. I didn't want to allow myself to be vulnerable, not to him, not to anyone ever again. His sins are not your own. You are not your father. His words echoed through my heart. I wonder if he'd overheard what I said to the night, but that would be impossible. I had whispered them. Perhaps the man told him something after that, but we hadn't been apart all night since. May I? He asked and brushed the hair from my shoulders. His fingers ran down my bare arms, causing me to shiver. Am I nothing but a pawn in your mission? I hated to ask, but I had to know. I didn't want to live for someone else's pleasure, not anymore. He caressed my cheek. I didn't want to like it, love it, but I did. I craved every touch. He inched closer and closer to my mouth until his hot breath tickled my lips. When his lips reached mine, I felt a surge of emotion pulse within me. Within seconds, I pulled him closer and closer until nothing was left between us. My fingers twirled through his curly hair. I tugged and grasped at him, not able to breathe without his lips. When he finally pulled away, I realized how ravenous I'd been. He wiped his mouth with the back of his wrist. He took off his overshirt and wrapped it around me. He pulled it tight, then centered me toward him. I'm not usually like this, I told him, a truth I felt I needed to share. What, you don't kiss all the boys this way? He grinned. Just like you kiss all the girls like that, I said, half wondering if it were true. I'd heard of how women threw themselves at his feet at court, and since he'd enchanted even me, cold, broken me, I couldn't imagine how normal girls would react to him. You're my first, he said just above a whisper. First what? I asked, then added, to be wife, I hope. I don't make a habit of kissing women who I have no intention of marrying, he clarified. You're not telling me that you've never kissed anyone, I know. The astonishment in my voice must have been apparent, because he looked away as if he were embarrassed. A twinge of guilt made me bite my lip and think about my words more carefully. He'd been vulnerable, and I hadn't exactly been forthcoming. He stole something very precious from me, my father. Something that cannot be replaced and has made me feel unworthy of anyone. Most especially someone like you. A silent moment of reflection passed between us. You saved me. Now, let me save you, he said, caressing my cheek. His words soothed every part of me. I closed my eyes and accepted my fate. The next morning's sunlight warmed my room, making me smile with excitement. That, in the memory of Arthur's perfect lips on mine. Breakfast, miss? A lovely maiden asked, her tendrils shimmering in the sunshine. Thank you. I devoured the meal within minutes. I made myself comfortable on the fluffy sofa, stared at the amazingly adorned room before me, and smiled. The whole experience seemed surreal. Why would anyone choose me? I'm a trader's daughter, a simpleton. He truly is a legend. I still couldn't shake that something wasn't right, though. He didn't behave like any other man I'd ever met. He was stoic in his own way, but it wasn't his emotions that puzzled me. He was too controlled. I would have given myself to him last night, but he didn't even try. He could have seduced me, but didn't. Instead, he remained a true gentleman, and though I appreciated it, I didn't understand it. The thought haunted me. Arthur had been away with his knights, discussing a neighboring village in a recent uproar, so I had more time to ponder over the events of the past few days. Even by supper, I couldn't shake the feeling that this just couldn't be right. I had to know more about Arthur's journey and how I fit into it. That night, when the world was fast asleep, I set out to find Merlin. I wasn't sure if Arthur would ever tell me the fullness of his mission, and maybe Merlin wouldn't either, but I had to try. I needed to know how I fit into this game. Why was I essential to the mission? Why did Excalibur choose me? I put on my robe and slippers and made my way down the stone stairway until I reached a door at the bottom of the landing. I slipped into the night and searched the grounds until I saw a light shimmering in the distance. I headed toward it. I had overheard a servant say that Merlin spent his nights conjuring things in the garden. The wizard intimidated me, for he knew my very thoughts and could see right through me. I couldn't hide anything from him and hoped beyond hope that he wouldn't hide anything from me. When I got close enough to see him, I paused. Might as well get out of those bushes. You know I know you're here. I took a deep breath and did as he said, approaching him slowly, carefully. I need to ask you something, I told him. I felt like a straightforward approach would be best. You're right. You should always be up front with me. The wizard turned around, holding his wand in his right hand. He placed the other hand on the tip that was glowing a bright blue. Within a second, he had extinguished the flame that had illuminated its tip. You've already spoken to Arthur. I suspect he told you all he wanted you to know. The wizard's brow rose high on his forehead, as if he were questioning me in some way, or waiting for me to answer him without any words. Arthur told me that Excalibur chose me. You said that too. He told me about his mission here, why they were sent, but he failed to mention the one thing I find imperative. Why am I here? You feel unworthy, unclean. Merlin's words stung deep and angered me. I balled my fists but said nothing. Why would Arthur marry someone like me? Royalty marries for convenience, for allegiance. It's a political decision. Earthly ties do not bind Arthur. He wants no agreement between other clans or communities. They may hold him back on his mission. That is why he would not marry royalty, much against the Knights of the Round Table's advisement, and everyone else who is in his company. With the exception of me, of course. No one fully knows the weight that is on his shoulders. Even I am a bit limited. The lady at the lake has told me little, but it's enough to know that his purpose here is greater than anything you or I could ever imagine. The world will speak of him in every generation from now until the end. I swallowed hard. No story I've ever heard compared to this one. There was no doubt that Merlin's words were true. And me? You see this wand? Merlin held the wand in front of him and stared at it for a moment until the tip of it glowed. This wand helps me complete my spells. It helps me wield the magic that's within me. You're very similar to the wand for Arthur. You have a strength within you that's necessary for Arthur. The feelings of brokenness, unworthiness, and humbleness provide you a natural connection to humanity that is crucial for anyone who marries him. Arthur is noble. he is royalty, but it is a nobility far beyond a crown. Goodness is at the core of his being. He must be with someone who is as genuine and strong as he is. I thought on this for a moment, but then realized an important word that he did not include when listing our similarities. And am I not good also? I would have expected Merlin to look away or to tell me some soft answer, but instead he chose to tell me the truth, as always. You will not always be good. You are human, after all. We are not without our failings, but you shouldn't compare yourself to Arthur. He is not as we are. As we are, I'm not like you either. I'm not a witch or some enchanted princess. I'm a girl. You're right, but even you and I are the same in one respect. We are mortal beings. We are not from the heavens, we are from the earth, and though we may become eternal in some afterlife, we are bound to the humanity we are born in. That is what I mean. I'm sure there had to be other women like me whom Arthur could marry. Merlin swirled his hands in a circle until a tiny cyclone of smoke rose between us. In the mist, faces of other women emerged. We are all replaceable. Sure, there were other women. There could be other women should you choose not to go forward with this marriage. But Arthur has taken a liking to you, and you've been specifically selected by Excalibur. Not to say he wouldn't select another should that be necessary, but you are the first. And Arthur is beginning the fulfillment of what must be accomplished. He needs the backing and the support and the legacy that will come from a marriage with you. I think I'm beginning to understand. Frustration mounted not because I was replaceable, I was used to that, but because I was chosen to deliver his legacy. Nothing more than a pawn in the mission, just as I suspected. No, that's not what I meant. The fruit you will bear will offer more than children. In fact, you will not have children at all. Merlin's words had become soft, but the truth behind them hit me like a boulder. I will never have children? My words were just above a whisper as I could hardly get them out. I never wanted to be treated as livestock, but to never have children, the thought crippled me. I folded my arms over my stomach, mourning the loss of something I never had. You will have so much more. The legacy of you and Arthur will live on and on and on. Does he even love me? If I don't have the love of children and I don't have the love of a husband, how can I go on? Arthur's mission is critical. You're not answering me. Does my future husband want me? Of course he cares about you. He cares for all humanity. That is why he's here, Merlin said with an anxious voice. I want him to love me. Or I want to stop desiring him. Did you put me under a spell? I held nothing back now. There was no point. I did not do anything to you. I can't assure you that there aren't external forces that guide every move any of us make. But I did not do this. I didn't know what else to say, so I found myself backing away until finally I turned and headed back toward the castle. I wasn't sure what exactly I would do with the information Merlin gave me. One thing was for certain. Arthur's principal and primary drive in his life will never be me or any queen, for that matter. It would always be his mission for humanity. I had to decide if I could burden this knowledge with peace. But if I couldn't have children, what other man would want me? Surely Arthur knew of my apparent infertility. Merlin made it clear that he always looks out for Arthur's well-being. I wasn't fully aware of my importance to Arthur's destiny. Before I could enter my room, I found Arthur in the hall. I left some space between us, not fully ready to confront him just yet. What's the matter? The genuine sincerity in his voice made me pause. I knew more than I ever wanted to know about our future because I asked questions I wasn't ready for. Things that people should never know. He must have sensed my reluctance because instead of pushing me to speak, he embraced me. He held my head so I could hear his pounding heart. I pulled away gently, not wanting to surrender myself completely until I made the decision to speak. I just spoke to Merlin. He glanced at the ground and then back at me. I know all of this seems impossible. I realize how much I'm asking of you, but if you'll have me, I promise to give you the very best of me. Do you, though? Your mission will always come first, not me. My words sounded as bitter as poisonous thorns. The whole reason I'm here is to complete and help humanity, and that will always be of utmost importance to me. But I'm fully man and long to share a life with you, to make memories with you. I long for companionship and love. You saved me, and I have a feeling you'll always save me. His jaw flinched, and his eyes flickered in the candlelight. I edged closer to him, mesmerized again by all that he was and the pureness of his heart. But nothing attracted me more than the mortal side of him, the way he moved and carried himself. I ran my fingers down his biceps, tracing the muscles. Every part of him was perfectly sculpted and breathtakingly handsome. I knew I'd never find another being who would set me on fire like him. It wasn't possible. You're asking me to accept that I will always be second in your life. I said it as a statement, but I wanted his confirmation. I'm asking you to be my wife, to enjoy the perks of everything that entails. There will be times when my mission, my calling, will distract and take away from our time together, but I promise to adore you. I will give you all that I have, emotionally, physically, and spiritually. I'll treat you like the treasure you are. I bit my lip. The anticipation of our upcoming wedding and the wedding night made me realize something I hadn't before. More than just caring about Arthur, I cared about Camelot. And though the concept for caring for the world was much too great for me to understand, I knew it was right to care about the future. I realized the importance of goodness, honor, and mercy in our world, all of which were of primary concern to Arthur. How could I turn away such an offer? How could I turn away from a man who loved people more than he loved himself? I took his hand, pulled him closer to me, stood on my tiptoes and kissed him. The same surge of passion, emotion, and incredible possibility gave me steadfast certainty. If I couldn't have children or have a legacy of my own, wouldn't it be better to be part of his? I love you, I said between kisses. I wanted him to know how committed I was to him, that I'd already chosen to be his wife, but when he didn't say it back, I pulled away. His eyes fluttered from me to the ground. I sensed that he wasn't ready to say such powerful words, not to me and possibly not to anyone. Is Arthur capable of loving someone in a romantic way? So what you're saying is that you want me, but you don't love me? I didn't say anything. Though Arthur was truthful, his body language, the way he looked at me, said everything. I hurriedly made my way to my room. I still did not understand everything, or how my life with Arthur could possibly be one worth living. If he couldn't love me, and I couldn't have children, and I chose to marry him, I couldn't imagine a world like that, a life like that. Would it not be better to marry someone for love? I lay in bed, the window open and the breeze blowing in. The night was quiet and calm, but a storm raged within me. A flurry of emotions tangled my very being. I wanted Arthur more than anything. I wanted to feel him, to touch him, to love him. I wanted to be part of that legacy Merlin had spoken about. But if I couldn't be sure of his love for me, how could I make such a decision? How can I marry him? Dreams have a strange way of telling us the things we already know and reminding us of the fears we've been trying to escape. I fought that night with my father, a symbolic representation of how horrible men could be, which told me everything I needed to know. I threw the covers off me and was unhappy to see that night was still upon us. I wanted to make things right. I needed all of my questions answered. With bare feet and nothing but my cotton shift, I snuck down the hall to Arthur's room, the one I hoped to someday share with him. I slowly pushed the knob and the door squeaked. I stepped in to find an empty bed, the glass doors to the balcony open, drapes dancing in the wind. That's when I saw Excalibur, propped up against the wall. I took the sword in my hands. It was heavier than I remembered. I struggled to pick it up. I tried to read the words etched into the metal. Salvator Electe. I felt powerful holding the sword the heavens gave to Arthur. I knew it had some type of enchantment. It was the house of some being that I didn't understand and would never be equal to. I forced it up into the sky and demanded that it tell me the truth and answer my questions because no one else would. "What are you?" I whispered. Tingles ran down my body, weakening my legs, and I stumbled. The sword's words lit up with that same enchanting blue I'd saw on Merlin's wand. Shocks began running down my arms until the pain was too much, and I dropped the sword. I held my trembling hands to my face as tears welled in my eyes. I didn't know if I could handle the weight of the truth that lay before me. I blinked rapidly and saw a translucent image emerge. Standing between the door and I stood a man who looked very similar to Arthur, with only slight distinctions in his features. This man was larger and more muscular. I could see through him, but he appeared to be very much real. Speechless and scared, I curled my knees to my chest and held myself, anxiously awaiting what the being may do. "I am legend," Excalibur said in a deep, strong voice. The group of beings Arthur spoke about, I barely got the words out. "I am the same as Arthur. We are legends. We live in the past, present, and future. We help aid humanity into pureness of heart. There are those who want to oppose us, as you have seen in the forest. The man I murdered. Your heart chose correctly that night, and you decided to follow it. Though mortals' hearts often lead them into trouble, yours, without knowing why, sided with honor. Arthur." The being placed his hand on his hip where another sword hung. "But what does all this have to do with me?" I stood up to face him, but pressed myself against the wall, ready to flee if I needed to. "I chose you because of your actions that night. You could have allowed him to die, but instead, you decided to kill someone, knowing full well there may be repercussions, to save him. That's what he needs. He must have you in his life for protection. He is a mighty warrior, but he is still mortal in this world, which means he's susceptible to every type of danger. I sensed you are willing to fight for what is right, given your past and its stain on your life." "But will he ever love me?" I asked, my voice quivering. "Ask him for yourself," Excalibur said, glancing over my shoulder. I turned to see Arthur standing in the open balcony doorway, illuminated by moonlight. I wiped the tears from my cheeks, not wanting him to see me cry. He came to me and took me into his arms. "We'd be honored if you'd join us on this journey of healing for your people. We can't promise it'll be easy, but we promise it'll be worth it," Excalibur said and took a knee. Arthur followed. I watched as both of them knelt before me, waiting for an answer to the biggest decision I would ever make. Arthur brought my hand to his lips and kissed it softly. "Please be my wife, Guinevere, for better and for worse, until the world separates us, even if only temporarily, by death. May our love be eternal and our bond stronger than the forged steel of Avalon," Arthur said. I knew the answer the moment I saw him. I would never be the same. He'd taken me from a world of great sorrow and no promise to one full of unspeakable hope. I nodded, not able to say the word. He took me into his arms and twirled me in the air. Our joy filled the room.
You had to fully give him your heart before he could give you his,
Excalibur said before returning to his host. I love all that you are and promise to be, my Guinevere. I am yours. We will always be bound by time, magic, and love. He whispered into my ear. And so began the tale of a great legend and his great love. The end.